The dust kicked up from Zelda Patterson's boots as she stepped off the afternoon stagecoach in Glenrio, New Mexico territory, and she knew immediately that her editor back in Boston would have called her reckless for making this journey alone. The year was 1883, and women simply did not travel unescorted across the country to interview cowboys for newspaper articles. But Zelda had never been one to follow convention. At 23 years old, she had already made a name for herself as the only female journalist at the Boston Chronicle, though most of her assignments involved writing about ladies' societies and charity functions. This trip was her chance to prove she could handle real journalism, the kind that mattered. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small town that straddled the border between New Mexico and Texas. Glenrio was hardly more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered around the railroad tracks, but it represented the frontier, the wild and untamed West that Eastern readers could not get enough of. Zelda adjusted her traveling suit, brushing away the red dust that seemed to coat everything, and surveyed her surroundings with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. A saloon stood to her left, its doors swinging slightly in the hot breeze. Across the dusty Main Street, she could see a general store, a blacksmith shop, and what appeared to be a small boarding house with peeling paint. Several horses were tethered to posts along the street, and a few men in wide-brimmed hats watched her with undisguised curiosity. She was used to being stared at. Her auburn hair, piled high beneath her practical traveling hat, and her green eyes often drew attention back east. Here, she suspected it was simply because she was a woman traveling alone. Zelda pulled the telegram from her reticule and read it again, though she had practically memorized the words. Jack Norton, rancher, 3 miles north of town, knows the territory better than anyone, will talk if approached right. Her contact in Santa Fe had sent it 2 weeks ago, along with assurances that Norton was the real thing, a genuine cowboy who had driven cattle from Texas to Kansas, fought rustlers, and survived more than his share of troubles on the open range. Can I help you, miss? A weathered man with a sheriff's badge approached her, his expression a mixture of concern and suspicion. I am looking for Jack Norton's ranch, Zelda said, meeting his gaze directly. She had learned early in her career that showing uncertainty invited dismissal. I have business with him. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. Business? Madam, Jack Norton is not the kind of man who usually conducts business with ladies. Nevertheless, I need to speak with him. Can you direct me to his property? The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then gestured north. 3 miles up the road. You will see the sign for the Double N Ranch. But, madam, I would not recommend riding out there alone. If you can wait until morning, I can arrange an escort. That will not be necessary, Zelda said firmly. Is there somewhere I can rent a horse? The livery is next to the blacksmith, the sheriff said slowly. But, madam, it will be dark in a few hours. These roads are not safe after sundown. Zelda softened her tone slightly. I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I assure you I am quite capable. I have not come all this way to wait in town. She could see the sheriff wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him it would be futile. He tipped his hat and stepped aside. Your choice, madam. Tom at the livery will set you up with a gentle mare. 20 minutes later, Zelda was riding north on a surprisingly spirited chestnut mare, her small traveling case secured behind the saddle. She had ridden since childhood, one of the few activities her Boston upbringing had prepared her for, and she found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait as the town fell away behind her. The landscape was unlike anything she had seen before. Vast expanses of golden grass stretched in every direction, interrupted occasionally by scrub brush, and the occasional gnarled tree. The sky seemed impossibly large, a dome of brilliant blue that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and exhilarated. She understood, suddenly, why people spoke of the West with such reverence and fear. It was beautiful and harsh in equal measure. The Double N Ranch announced itself with a weathered wooden arch over a dirt road that branched off from the main path. Zelda guided her horse beneath it and continued toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. As she drew closer, she could make out a main house, modest but well-maintained, along with a large barn, several corrals, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse. A man emerged from the barn as she approached, and Zelda felt her breath catch slightly. Even from a distance, she could tell he was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his surroundings. He wore dusty trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a worn leather vest. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark hair and a face that was both rugged and, she had to admit, quite handsome. "You are lost," he called out as she rode closer. It was not a question. "I am looking for Jack Norton," Zelda replied, bringing her mare to a stop a respectful distance away. "You found him." He crossed his arms over his chest, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her sit straighter in the saddle. "What can I do for you?" Zelda dismounted, grateful that her legs felt steady despite the long ride. "My name is Zelda Patterson. I am a journalist with the Boston Chronicle, and I would like to interview you." For a moment, Jack Norton simply stared at her. Then, to her surprise, he threw back his head and laughed. It was a genuine sound, rich and warm, and despite herself, Zelda felt her cheeks flush. "A journalist," he repeated, still chuckling. "From Boston, and you rode out here alone to interview me." "Is that so difficult to believe?" Zelda asked, lifting her chin. "Madam, I do not give interviews. I am a rancher, not some traveling show curiosity for Eastern readers to gawk at over their breakfast." "I am not writing a circus review, Mr. Norton," Zelda said firmly. "I am writing about the real West, about the men who work this land and the lives they lead. My editor believes readers want authentic stories, not the dime novel nonsense that currently passes for Western journalism." Jack's expression shifted slightly, the amusement fading into something more thoughtful. "And what makes you think I have any stories worth telling?" "My sources say you have driven cattle across some of the most dangerous territory in the West, that you have helped settle land disputes and defended your property against rustlers, that you know this country better than almost anyone." Zelda paused. "I want to tell your story. The real story, not some embellished tale." "Your sources talk too much," Jack muttered, but she could see she had his attention. He studied her for another long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "It will be dark soon. You can stay the night in the guest room, and we will talk in the morning. Then you can ride back to town with your story or without it, depending on whether I like your questions." "I do not want to impose," Zelda began, though the thought of riding back to town in the growing darkness had begun to worry her. "You already have," Jack said, but his tone was not unkind. "Come on. I will show you where to stable your horse, and then we will see about getting you some dinner." As Zelda led her mare toward the barn, following Jack's broad back, she found herself reassessing her initial impression. He was younger than she had expected, probably no more than 26 or 27, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of outdoor work. There was a quiet strength about him, an economy of movement that suggested he never wasted energy on unnecessary actions. The barn was well organized and clean, with several horses already settled in their stalls for the evening. Jack showed her where to unsaddle her mare and where to find feed and water, standing back and watching with what might have been approval as she handled the tasks herself. You know your way around horses, he observed. I grew up riding, Zelda said, brushing down the mare. Though admittedly on much better groomed trails than the one I took to get here. That was not even a rough trail, Jack said, and she thought she detected a hint of amusement in his voice. If you want to write about the real West, you are going to have to develop a stronger stomach for dust and discomfort. I have a perfectly strong stomach, thank you, Zelda replied, perhaps more sharply than she intended. I did not travel 2,000 miles to be coddled. Jack held up his hands in a gesture of peace. Fair enough. Come on. Let's get you settled before you decide to challenge me to a cattle drive to prove your toughness. The house was simpler than Zelda had expected, but comfortable. Jack led her to a small room off the main hallway, furnished with a bed, a washstand, and a simple dresser. It is not fancy, but it is clean, he said. I will give you some time to freshen up. When you are ready, come to the kitchen and we will see about dinner. Alone in the room, Zelda allowed herself a moment to absorb what had happened. She was staying overnight at a bachelor rancher's house, unchaperoned and hundreds of miles from anyone who knew her. Her mother would have fainted dead away at the scandal, but this was why she had come west, was it not? To escape the suffocating conventions of Boston society and prove that women could do more than pour tea and gossip about their neighbors. She washed her face and hands in the basin, grateful for the cool water after the dusty ride. Her traveling suit was rumpled and stained, but there was nothing to be done about that now. She unpinned her hair, brushed it out, and then pinned it back up in a simpler style than she would have worn in Boston. When she finally made her way to the kitchen, she found Jack standing over a large stove, stirring something in a pot. I hope you are not expecting anything fancy, he said without turning around. I can manage basic cooking, but I am not going to win any awards. After a day of traveling, anything hot will be wonderful, Zelda assured him. She looked around the kitchen, noting the worn but well-maintained furniture, the practical organization of supplies, the complete absence of any feminine touch. Do you manage this ranch alone? I have 2 hands who work for me, but they are out on the range right now, checking on the herd. They will be back tomorrow. Jack ladled what looked like stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table. Sit down. Tell me about Boston while we eat. Over dinner, Zelda found herself relaxing in ways she had not expected. Jack was easy to talk to, asking thoughtful questions about her work, her journey, and what had possessed her to become a journalist in the first place. She told him about fighting for her position at the Chronicle, about the skepticism she faced from male colleagues who believed women belonged in the home, not the newsroom. And what made you want to write about the West? Jack asked, pushing his empty bowl aside. Honestly, I was tired of writing about charity balls and ladies' auxiliary meetings, Zelda said. I wanted to write something that mattered, something real. The West represents everything the East has lost. Freedom, possibility, the chance to build something with your own hands. But all the stories being published are either romantic nonsense or sensationalized violence. I wanted to show the truth. Jack leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark, intense eyes. And you think spending a few days out here will give you that truth? I think talking to people like you will help, Zelda said. People who actually live this life instead of inventing stories about it. All right, Jack said after a moment. I will give you your interview, but I want to show you what ranch life actually looks like, not just tell you stories. If you are going to write about it, you should understand what the work involves. I would appreciate that, Zelda said, trying to keep the excitement from her voice. This was exactly what she had hoped for, a real glimpse into the daily life of a working ranch. We start early, Jack warned. Sun up, which out here means about 5 in the morning. Think you can handle that? I have been up earlier covering breaking news in Boston, Zelda said confidently. Jack's expression suggested he doubted that was quite the same thing, but he did not argue. Then we should both get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, Zelda felt a strange mixture of accomplishment and anticipation. She had made it to New Mexico, found her subject, and secured his cooperation. Everything was going according to plan. But there was something about Jack Norton that unsettled her in ways she had not anticipated. He was not the rough, uneducated cowboy she had half expected. He was thoughtful, well-spoken, and there was a depth to him that she suspected would take more than a few days to understand. A rooster's crow woke her far too early the next morning, followed shortly by a knock on her door. "Sun is up," Jack's voice called from the hallway. "If you want breakfast before we start work, you had better get moving." Zelda dressed quickly in her most practical skirt and shirtwaist, pinned her hair securely, and made her way to the kitchen. Jack was already there, frying eggs and bacon on the stove. He glanced at her outfit and shook his head slightly. "You cannot work in that," he said bluntly. "Do you have anything more suitable?" "This is my most practical outfit," Zelda said defensively. Jack finished plating the breakfast and set it on the table. "After we eat, I will find you something that will not get you killed. You cannot ride or work around cattle in a skirt like that." Half an hour later, Zelda found herself in a pair of trousers that Jack had somehow procured, along with a simple work shirt. The trousers had belonged to a ranch hand who had moved on, Jack explained, and though they were slightly too large, they would do for the day. Zelda had never worn trousers in her life, and the freedom of movement was both strange and exhilarating. "Better," Jack said approvingly when she emerged from changing. "Now you look like you might actually survive a day's work." The morning was spent learning the basics of ranch management. Jack showed her how to check on the horses, how to properly mend a fence line, and how to identify which cattle needed closer attention. He explained the economics of ranching, the challenges of weather and predators, the constant struggle to keep the operation profitable. Zelda took notes furiously, her journalist's mind cataloging every detail. What surprised her most was Jack's patience. He never condescended or treated her questions as foolish. When she struggled to understand something, he found different ways to explain it until it made sense. And despite the hard work, she found herself enjoying the physical labor in ways she never had enjoyed anything back in Boston. By midday, they stopped for a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and water from the well. They sat in the shade of the barn, and Zelda finally asked the question she had been wanting to ask all morning. "Why did you agree to this? To let me stay and interview you?" Jack was quiet for a moment, staring out at the horizon. "Honestly, I am not entirely sure. Maybe because you came all this way yourself. That took courage. Or maybe because I am tired of reading lies about what life is like out here, and I figured if someone was going to write about it, it might as well be someone willing to actually see it. Can I ask you about your past?" Zelda ventured. "My sources mentioned cattle drives and rustlers. Your sources seem to know a lot," Jack said dryly, but he did not refuse to answer. "I came out here when I was 18, worked as a hand on a ranch in Texas. Learned the trade, saved my money, and eventually bought this place 5 years ago. I have done 3 cattle drives from Texas to Kansas. And yes, we have had our share of trouble with rustlers and claim jumpers. This is not easy country, and there are plenty of men who would rather steal than work for what they want." "Have you ever had to defend your property by force?" Zelda asked, pen poised over her notepad. Jack's expression darkened slightly. "A few times. I do not enjoy violence, Miss Patterson, but I will protect what is mine. Most of the time, showing you are willing to fight is enough to make trouble move on to easier targets. They spent the afternoon riding out to check on his herd, about 100 head of cattle spread across several hundred acres of grazing land. Zelda had never seen so much open space, and despite the heat and dust, she found herself captivated by the stark beauty of it all. As they rode back toward the ranch house in the late afternoon, Jack pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the land, about the Apache who had lived here before white settlers arrived, about the Spanish who had come even before that. He spoke with respect about the native peoples, acknowledging the injustices they had suffered, and Zelda appreciated his honesty about the complicated history of the territory. "You are not what I expected," she said, as they unsaddled their horses in the barn. "And what did you expect?" Jack asked, looking at her with genuine curiosity. "Someone more rough, I suppose, less thoughtful. The stories I have read made cowboys sound like they were barely civilized." Jack laughed. "Some of us are barely civilized, but most of us are just people trying to make a living in a hard place. We are not that different from folks back east, just dealing with different challenges." That evening, after another simple dinner, they sat on the porch as the sun set in a spectacular display of orange and purple. Zelda had filled pages of her notepad with observations and quotes, but she found herself more interested in simply talking to Jack about everything and nothing at all. "Tell me about Boston," Jack said, leaning back in his chair. "What is it actually like, living in a city that big?" Zelda described the crowded streets, the constant noise, the way you could walk for hours and never see the horizon. She told him about the gas lights and the theaters, the newspaper offices and the grand hotels. And as she spoke, she realized how small and confining it all seemed compared to the vastness of New Mexico. "You miss it?" Jack asked. "Parts of it," Zelda admitted. "But being here, seeing all this space and freedom, I understand why people talk about the West the way they do. There is something intoxicating about it. It can be lonely too," Jack said quietly. "All this space means your nearest neighbor might be miles away. When things go wrong, you handle them yourself because there is no one else around. Is that why you never married?" Zelda asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I apologize. That was inappropriate." But Jack did not seem offended. "Never found the right person, I suppose. Most women who come out here either do not stay long or they are already spoken for. And I have been too busy building this ranch to spend much time courting." They talked late into the evening, long after the stars had come out in their thousands. Zelda had never seen so many stars, had never realized the sky could look like this, vast and glittering and impossibly beautiful. Jack pointed out constellations, told her stories about cattle drives under these same stars, about nights when the herd would spook and every hand would have to ride hard to keep them from stampeding. "I should let you get some sleep," Jack finally said, though he sounded reluctant. "Tomorrow I thought we could ride into town early and I could introduce you to some of the other ranchers and hands, get you more perspectives for your article." "That would be wonderful," Zelda said, standing and brushing dust from her borrowed trousers. "Thank you, Jack, for all of this. It has been more than I hoped for." "You are welcome," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. In the starlight, his expression was difficult to read, but there was an intensity there that made her heart beat a little faster. The next day followed a similar pattern, with morning chores followed by a ride into Glenrio. Jack introduced her to several other ranchers, to the men who worked for them, to the shopkeepers and the blacksmith, and even the saloon owner. Everyone seemed to respect Jack, and his endorsement gave Zelda access she never would have achieved on her own. She spent the day collecting stories, filling notebook after notebook with observations and quotes. But she found her attention constantly drawn back to Jack, to the way he moved through the world with such quiet confidence, to the respect he showed everyone regardless of their station, to the moments when his eyes would meet hers and everything else would fade away. That night, after another dinner and another evening on the porch, Zelda finally admitted to herself what was happening. She was developing feelings for Jack Norton, feelings that went far beyond professional interest or journalistic curiosity. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She had known him for less than 3 days. She was here to write a story, not fall in love with her subject, but her heart did not seem to care about logic. "I should be heading back to Boston soon," Zelda said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have more than enough material for my article." "When do you plan to leave?" Jack asked, and was it her imagination or did he sound disappointed? "I suppose I should take the stagecoach day after tomorrow," Zelda said. "That will give me time to organize my notes and make sure I have not missed anything important." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to face her fully, and in the lamplight from the house, she could see something vulnerable in his expression, something that made her breath catch. "What if you did not go back?" he asked softly. "What do you mean? What if you stayed here?" "In New Mexico, I mean. You said yourself that the East feels small and confining, and I have seen you these past few days. You come alive out here in ways I suspect you never did in Boston." Zelda's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Jack, I cannot just abandon my career, my life. I am not asking you to abandon anything," Jack said, standing and moving closer to her. "I am asking you to consider building a different life, here, with me." "We have only known each other for 3 days, Zelda protested weakly. "I know. And maybe I am crazy for saying this so soon. But I have met a lot of people in my life, Zelda, and I have never met anyone like you. You are brave and smart, and you do not back down from challenges. You ask real questions and you actually listen to the answers. And when I think about you leaving, getting on that stagecoach and going back to Boston, it feels wrong in a way I cannot explain." Zelda felt tears prickling at her eyes. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I have felt it since the first day, and I kept telling myself it was just the excitement of being somewhere new, doing something different. But it is more than that, is it not?" "Much more," Jack confirmed. He reached out and gently took her hand. "I am not good with fancy words. I am just a rancher who knows how to work hard and take care of what is mine. But if you would stay, if you would give this a chance, I promise I would spend every day trying to make you happy." "What are you asking me exactly?" Zelda asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "I am asking you to marry me," Jack said simply. "I know it is fast and I know it is crazy, but out here we do not waste time on drawn-out courtships. When you know something is right, you act on it. And this feels right, Zelda. You feel right." Zelda looked at him, at this man she had known for such a short time, but who somehow felt like he understood her better than people she had known for years. She thought about Boston, about the newspaper office where she was tolerated but never truly valued, about the endless rounds of social obligations, and the constant battle to be taken seriously. Then she thought about the past 3 days, about the freedom she had felt here, about the way Jack looked at her like she was capable of anything. "Yes," she said, and the word came out more confident than she expected. "Yes, I will marry you." Jack's face broke into a grin that transformed him, making him look younger and impossibly happy. He pulled her into his arms, and when he kissed her, Zelda felt like she was finally exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married a week later in Glenrio's small church, with the sheriff and his wife standing as witnesses. Zelda wore a simple dress purchased from the general store, and Jack wore his best shirt and a string tie. It was nothing like the elaborate society weddings she had attended in Boston, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. She sent a telegram to her editor, explaining that she would not be returning to Boston, but would continue to send articles about life in the West. His response was terse and disapproving, but he agreed to continue publishing her work as long as it met his standards. She wrote to her parents as well, trying to explain the sudden marriage, knowing they would be shocked and probably disappointed. But she found she did not care as much as she thought she would. This was her life now, and she was choosing it freely. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Zelda had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the endless cycle of chores and work that kept the place running. She learned to cook over the large stove, though her first several attempts were disasters that had Jack diplomatically suggesting they stick to simpler meals. She learned to help with the horses and cattle, to mend fences and fix equipment, to handle a rifle for protection against predators. Jack was patient with her learning process, never making her feel inadequate when she struggled. And gradually, Zelda found herself becoming competent in ways she never had been in Boston. Her hands, which had only ever held pens and teacups, became calloused and strong. Her skin, which she had always protected from the sun, became tanned and freckled. She felt healthier and more capable than she ever had in her life. The ranch hands returned from their extended time on the range and were initially skeptical of the boss's sudden marriage to an Eastern journalist. But Zelda won them over with her willingness to work and her genuine interest in their stories. She continued to write articles for the Chronicle and eventually for other publications, sending dispatches about real life in the West that were praised for their authenticity and insight. But more than the work or the writing, Zelda loved the life she was building with Jack. They would talk for hours in the evenings, sharing stories and dreams and plans for the future. Jack taught her to read the weather, to understand the subtle signs that meant rain or drought, good grazing or trouble ahead. She taught him about literature and history, reading to him in the evenings from the books she had brought from Boston. Their physical intimacy grew naturally from their emotional connection, and Zelda discovered aspects of herself she had never known existed. Jack was gentle and passionate, making her feel cherished and desired in ways that still made her blush to think about. They would lie together in the darkness, skin to skin, talking and laughing and making plans for their future. 6 months after their wedding, Zelda realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She was far from any major hospital, far from the doctors and medical care she had taken for granted in Boston. But Jack reassured her that women had been having babies in the West for decades, and the doctor in the next town over was experienced and competent. The pregnancy was difficult at times. Morning sickness kept her bedridden for weeks, and the summer heat was oppressive in ways that made her long for the cool Boston summers of her childhood. But Jack was attentive and caring, taking over her usual chores without complaint and making sure she rested as much as possible. As her belly grew, so did her appreciation for the life they were building together. The ranch was thriving under Jack's careful management, and they had been able to expand the herd and hire another hand. Zelda continued to write, though now her articles included observations about frontier motherhood and the challenges facing women in the West. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1885, delivered by the town doctor with Jack pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. They named him James, after Jack's father, and from the moment Zelda held him, she knew she had never felt such overwhelming love. Jack was a devoted father, surprising Zelda with his tenderness toward the tiny infant. He would hold James for hours, talking to him about the ranch and the cattle and everything they would do together when he was older. Watching them together, Zelda felt her heart overflow with gratitude for the improbable series of events that had brought her to this place, to this life. The next few years passed in a blur of work and growth and small joys. James grew from infant to toddler, and Zelda marveled at how quickly time moved. She continued her journalism work, though now she focused more on longer pieces and essays rather than breaking news. Her writing had gained a significant following back east, and publishers were beginning to ask her to consider writing a book about her experiences. When James was 3, Zelda became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was simply stronger and more acclimated to ranch life. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1888, a tiny thing with auburn hair like her mother's and her father's dark eyes. They named her Caroline, and James was immediately smitten with his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch continued to prosper, and they were able to build an addition onto the house, giving the children their own rooms and adding a proper study where Zelda could work on her writing. Jack's reputation as a fair and skilled rancher grew, and he was often called upon to help settle disputes or advise on land management issues. But it was the small moments that Zelda treasured most. Summer evenings on the porch with Jack while the children played in the yard. Winter nights gathered around the fire while she read stories and Jack whittled small toys. The way Jack would still look at her sometimes, as if he could not quite believe his luck. The way her heart would skip when he smiled at her, even after years of marriage. They faced challenges, of course. There were droughts that tested their water supplies and harsh winters that decimated the herd. There were illnesses that swept through the territory, and times when money was tight and worry kept them both awake at night. But they faced everything together, their partnership strengthening with each obstacle overcome. One evening, when James was 7 and Caroline 4, Zelda found herself standing on the porch alone, watching the sun set over the land that had become her home. She heard the door open behind her and felt Jack's arms wrap around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About how different my life is from what I imagined," Zelda said. "When I got off that stagecoach in Glenrio all those years ago, I thought I was just here to write a story. I never imagined I would stay, that I would build a whole life here. Do you regret it?" Jack asked, and she could hear the vulnerability in his voice, the fear that she might sometimes wish for the life she had left behind. Zelda turned in his arms to face him. Even after all these years, he still made her pulse quicken. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This life with you, with our children on this land, it is everything I never knew I wanted. I came here looking for a story, and instead I found myself. I found home." Jack kissed her then, tender and deep, and Zelda felt the same rush of emotion she had felt on their wedding day. They stood there as the sun finished setting, wrapped in each other's arms, while the sounds of their children's laughter drifted from inside the house. Zelda did eventually write her book, a collection of essays and observations about life in the West that became a bestseller back east. The royalties allowed them to make further improvements to the ranch and to put money aside for the children's education. But she always insisted that her greatest accomplishment was not her writing but the life she had built. As the years passed, Glenrio grew from a small frontier outpost into a more established town. The railroad brought more people and more opportunities, but also more complications. Jack became involved in local politics, serving on the town council and helping to establish a proper school. Zelda taught there occasionally, sharing her education with the next generation of frontier children. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch as much as his father did. He would follow Jack everywhere, learning every aspect of ranch management, asking endless questions that Jack answered with patience and pride. Caroline was more like her mother, curious about everything, always reading and writing and asking questions about the wider world. When Zelda was 35 and Jack 38, they welcomed a third child, another son they named Daniel. The pregnancy was unexpected and more difficult than the previous ones, and for a time, both Zelda and the baby's lives were in danger. But both pulled through, and Daniel proved to be a happy, healthy child who brought new energy to the household. Jack sold a portion of the ranch's land to the railroad company when the expansion came through, using the money to ensure their family's financial security. He remained a working rancher at heart, but now they had the luxury of hiring enough hands that the work did not consume every waking moment. This gave them more time together as a family, and Zelda cherished those years. She continued to write, though now mostly for her own pleasure rather than publication deadlines. She had proven everything she needed to prove, accomplished everything she had set out to do and more. Her articles had changed how many Easterners viewed the West, replacing romanticized nonsense with authentic accounts of real people and real lives. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Jack surprised her with a trip to Santa Fe. It was the first time they had been away from the ranch for more than a day since James was born, and it felt strange and wonderful to have time alone together. They stayed in a hotel, ate in restaurants, and wandered through the historic plaza like young lovers instead of an established married couple with 3 children. "You remember when we first met?" Jack asked as they sat in the hotel room one evening. "When you rode up to the ranch looking so determined and out of place. I remember thinking you were nothing like I expected," Zelda said, smiling at the memory. "I expected a rough cowboy and found an intelligent, thoughtful man instead. And I expected a pushy journalist and found the woman I would spend the rest of my life with," Jack said. He pulled her into his arms, and despite the years and the children and the calluses on both their hands, Zelda still felt that same flutter of excitement she had felt the first time he touched her. They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion of 2 people who still desired each other deeply. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Zelda thought about the improbable path that had brought them together, the chance assignment that had changed everything. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I have loved you since those first few days, even though I tried to convince myself it was impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Jack murmured, pulling her closer. "You proved that the day you decided to stay, the day you chose this life, chose me." Back at the ranch, life continued its steady rhythm. James, now a young man of 18, had become Jack's right hand, managing much of the daily operations with competence and confidence. He had inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's intelligence, and Jack often said he could not have asked for a better son. Caroline, at 15, was preparing to attend a women's college in the East, something that filled Zelda with both pride and melancholy. Her daughter was brilliant and ambitious, wanting to study literature and perhaps become a teacher or writer herself. Zelda saw herself in Caroline's fierce independence and determination, and she made sure her daughter knew that she could choose any path she wanted. Daniel, at 10, was still young enough to simply enjoy childhood. He was the most easygoing of their children, happy whether he was helping on the ranch or buried in a book, equally comfortable with physical work and intellectual pursuits. When Zelda was 42, her mother passed away in Boston, and she made the journey east for the first time since leaving. Jack insisted on accompanying her, leaving James in charge of the ranch. It was strange to return to the city after so many years, to see how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. At her mother's funeral, Zelda's old colleagues from the Chronicle approached her, expressing amazement at how she had changed. She was no longer the ambitious young woman desperate to prove herself. She had become confident and self-assured, comfortable in her own skin in ways they seemed to recognize and envy. "You made it all work," one of them said. "The career, the family, the unconventional life. Many of us thought you were throwing everything away when you stayed in New Mexico." "I did not throw anything away," Zelda said gently. "I found what really mattered. The work I do now means more because I am writing about my own life, my own experiences. And I have a partner who supports me completely, who never asked me to choose between my writing and my family." Back in New Mexico, life continued. Caroline left for college, and the house felt emptier without her constant chatter and questions. But she wrote long letters home, full of enthusiasm for her studies and descriptions of life in the East. Zelda answered every letter with her own observations, maintaining their connection across the distance. James married at 21, a lovely young woman named Sarah who had grown up on a neighboring ranch. Zelda welcomed her daughter-in-law with open arms, grateful that James had found someone who understood ranch life and loved him for who he was. When James and Sarah's first child was born, making Zelda and Jack grandparents, it felt both strange and wonderful to see the cycle continuing. The turn of the century brought changes to New Mexico and to the West in general. The wild frontier of Zelda's youth was disappearing, replaced by towns and railroads and increasing civilization. But on the ranch, the essential rhythms remained the same. Cattle still needed tending, land still needed managing, and the work that had defined Jack's life continued. Jack's hair had gone gray at the temples, and Zelda's auburn had faded to a softer shade streaked with silver. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had been 20 years ago, standing on that porch and admitting their impossible, improbable love. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had said no?" Zelda asked one evening as they sat together watching another sunset. It was a familiar spot, the same porch where Jack had proposed all those years ago. "I try not to think about it," Jack admitted. "The thought of living all these years without you, it is unbearable." "I would have gone back to Boston," Zelda mused. "Written my article about the cowboy I interviewed. Maybe it would have been well received, maybe not. I would have continued working at the Chronicle, fighting for better assignments, trying to prove myself over and over. Eventually, I suppose I would have married someone suitable, some businessman or lawyer my parents approved of." "Would you have been happy?" Jack asked. "I would have thought I was," Zelda said slowly. "I would not have known any different, but it would have been such a small life compared to this, such a pale imitation of what I have now." Jack reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "I am glad you said yes, glad you took the chance." "So am I," Zelda said softly. "Every single day I am glad." Daniel decided to attend university in Santa Fe, studying agriculture and modern ranching techniques. He planned to return to the ranch afterward, bringing new knowledge to improve their operations. Caroline graduated with honors and became a teacher, eventually returning to New Mexico to teach at the expanded Glenrio School. Both children had found ways to blend the education and opportunities Zelda had insisted upon with the Western life they loved. When Jack was 55, he had a health scare that frightened them both. A bad fall from a horse left him with broken ribs and a concussion, and for several days Zelda barely left his side, terrified that she might lose him. He recovered, but it was a reminder that they were no longer young, that their time together, precious as it was, would not last forever. After that, they made a conscious effort to savor each day. They took more time for themselves, letting James and Daniel handle more of the ranch work. They would ride out together to their favorite spots on the property, places where they had shared important moments over the years. They would talk about their children and grandchildren, about the life they had built, about everything and nothing at all. One morning, when Zelda was 53 and Jack 56, he found her in her study working on a new essay. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her write with the same focus and intensity she had brought to everything she did. "What are you working on?" he asked. "A memoir of sorts," Zelda said, setting down her pen. "About coming west, about our life together. I want our grandchildren to know the real story, not some romanticized version." "And what is the real story?" Jack asked, moving to sit beside her. "That love can happen in the most unexpected ways," Zelda said. "That sometimes the best decisions are the ones that seem completely crazy at the time. That home is not a place but a person, a choice you make every single day." Jack pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "I would read that book." "You will be the first to get a copy," Zelda promised. As they sat together in the study, surrounded by the evidence of Zelda's writing career, the books and articles and awards that represented decades of work, she thought about that young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Glenrio so many years ago. That woman had been brave and determined, but she had also been lonely and searching for something she could not quite name. She had found it in the most unlikely place, with the most unlikely person. A cowboy she had come to interview, who had offered her not just a story but an entire life. And she had been brave enough to say yes, to take the risk, to build something extraordinary out of what had started as a simple newspaper assignment. The memoir took her 2 years to write, and when it was published, it became her most successful work yet. Readers were captivated by the love story at its heart, by the vivid descriptions of frontier life, by the honest portrayal of the challenges and joys of building a life in the West. Zelda gave talks at universities and women's clubs, always emphasizing that women did not have to choose between careers and families, between adventure and stability. With the right partner, she insisted, all things were possible. Jack attended some of these talks, sitting in the audience and watching his wife speak with the same pride he had felt watching her learn to ride fence lines and rope cattle all those years ago. She had never stopped being extraordinary, had never stopped pushing boundaries and defying expectations. And he had never stopped being grateful that she had chosen him, chosen this life. Their golden anniversary approached when Zelda was 73 and Jack 76. The celebration was enormous, with children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren gathered at the ranch. Friends from all over New Mexico came to honor the couple who had become something of a legend in the territory. During the party, as Zelda looked around at the crowd of people, at the family they had created, and the community they had helped build, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This life, so different from anything she had imagined as a young woman in Boston, had exceeded her wildest dreams. Jack found her standing alone on the porch, taking a moment away from the celebration. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, just as he had done thousands of times over the past 50 years. "Happy anniversary," he murmured into her hair. "Happy anniversary," Zelda replied, leaning back against him. 50 years. Can you believe it?" "Some days it feels like 50 years, Jack admitted. "Some days it feels like just yesterday that you rode up to the ranch, all determination and Eastern manners, asking to interview me." "And you laughed at me," Zelda reminded him. "I laughed because I could not believe my luck," Jack corrected. "A beautiful, brilliant woman showing up at my door, wanting to know my story. What were the odds? What were the odds indeed? Zelda murmured. They stood together as the sun set, as it had set thousands of times during their marriage. The land stretched before them, golden in the fading light, the same land where they had worked and struggled and built their life together. Inside, they could hear their family laughing and talking, generations connected by the choice two people had made 50 years ago. "I would do it all again," Zelda said softly. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, I would make the same choice." "So would I," Jack said. 1,000 times over I would choose you." They stood there until the stars came out, the same stars that had witnessed their courtship, their marriage, and every significant moment of their life together. And Zelda thought about that first night on the porch, when Jack had asked her to stay to marry him, to build a life with him in this wild, beautiful place. She had come to interview a cowboy for a newspaper, and left with a marriage proposal instead. It was the best story she had ever written, and the best decision she had ever made. And as she stood there in her husband's arms, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, Zelda knew that some stories do not end, they just keep getting better with each passing year.